Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. Now let's take a look at what you can do to evaluate the consequences of economic growth. Of course, growth seems good, growth is positive, but there are negative outcomes as a result, and a lot of it depends on what segment of the society that you're talking about or what aspect of society that you're talking about. Economic growth does not necessarily mean great outcomes for everybody involved in the economy. So this is a really critical set of information that you need to have because, of course, after you understand how to demonstrate economic growth on a diagram, you understand that it's supply side, it could be supply side growth, it could be demand side growth, and how the government can do it. You need to understand the soft stuff, the story behind the growth, which is what makes, I think anyway, economics so interesting and actually really complex. Okay, so this is a critical piece of information to have in your head. It's very much like a story. You got to consider the perspective, and then you as the economist, because that's what the IB demands of you, are the one who's going to make the final decision as to what the government should do, which means you need to have this information in your head. So let's take a look. Okay, positive consequences. Of course, it could be assumed, right, that on the whole, it's an economic goal, it's one of the overall macroeconomic goals of a government, that growth is positive. And it is true. If the aggregate demand steadily increases over time and the population size increases, then there will be growth. But without supply side improvements, right, to the LRAS, aggregate demand would increase more than aggregate supply, and there would be inflation. However, when growth occurs, which results in pushing out the longer aggregate supply curve, economies can actually experience what is called non-inflationary growth, which is where the quantity or quality of the factors of production improves, and as a result, the price level actually stays the same. And you can see, right, a shift in AD from 81 to 82, if long-run aggregate supply were not to shift, would result in purely inflationary pressure. But if they both move out, then you get a situation where there's more output, right, more demand, but the same price level. Okay, so that would be a beautiful way of demonstrating non-inflationary growth. Both of these must occur at the same time, and that's the positive consequence. That's also the goal of many, many governments, of course. All right, let's take a look at a few more. So, supply-side policies and the growth that they bring about result, if you see this, in lower unemployment, right, and downward pressure on price levels. These two things could result in bringing about the following. Of course, higher living standards for the people in the country, improved technology, increased tax revenue for the government, improved standing internationally in terms of trade, and an overall level of education always equals higher levels of democracy and freedom. And this is kind of a soft thing to throw in there. But you need to understand at least three of these. I always tell students everything in threes. Understand three positive consequences of growth: higher living standards, improved technologies, increased tax revenue for the government, the international context, and level of education. So each one of these, right, individually, let's talk about them for a second. So if you take higher living standards, it kind of makes sense, right? If you have increased growth or increased economic growth, then the living standards should go up. Okay, why? Well, because there's an increase in national output, right? And as GDP per capita increases, then the average person will increase its income. And therefore, that can be equated with higher living standards, right? And if you think about the easiest example is think about the living standards of your parents and your grandparents. Is your living standard now better? Okay, if the answer is yes, well then, as a result of economic growth, I live in Chile, and definitely, the 60, 70-year-olds tell you about the massive changes that have happened in Santiago. They are a result of economic growth, and the children who are 10, 12 years old nowadays in Chile have more opportunities, a higher standard of living, health, education, than they did before, okay? So another thing that can be brought about by growth, of course, is an improvement in technology. And if you think about it, economic growth has always been achieved by increases in technology, but it's also contributed to them, right? Leading to advances in medicine, whatever. Look around your house. Everything, if you have a dishwasher, there is that somebody used to do, transportation. It goes on and on. Technology tends to make people's lives a little bit easier, and that contributes to higher standards of living. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is to look at developed nations and agricultural workers. Agricultural workers in developed nations can almost plant their corn and wheat without actually touching the dirt. And that doesn't mean that they're, why is that? Because they have machines that do all of it. And as a result, they can produce a lot more. And the assumption then is that the farmer would be able to have a higher level of income, which of course isn't necessarily true. But advances of technology have an important impact on, they create growth, but they also, growth contributes to them as well. All right, the third thing is increased tax revenue for the government. Obviously, if there are higher incomes, right, the government is going to receive more money because a percentage of a higher income is more money. And so that could lead to better, more government spending on merit goods, on public goods. If you go, I've told my students that I would love to write a doctoral thesis on development and public parks in the country. If you've had the luxury of being able to travel a lot, just go to the center of a town, a small town, and look at the park. If the park is well maintained and there are people in it, and especially if people are lying in the grass, then you can almost see directly the improvement in tax revenue on the production and the spending of merit goods. The public services are functioning. If you go to a less developed nation, the public parks will probably be not as well maintained. They might not be as clean. You might not even see them. So tax systems also redistribute income and reduce income inequalities. That's the other nice thing about increased economic growth. Because the government has more money, they can provide more services. Okay? So the tax system is influenced or affected and is a positive consequence of economic growth. Okay. Next up, the international context. Higher productivity may bring a result in improved competitiveness of a country's exports. That's not necessarily always the case, but it has to be recognized that higher national incomes also increases the demand for imports. So, more developed nations, wealthier nations tend to export more because they actually are producing things themselves that other people want, but they also import more. And Chile is a fantastic example of a place that produces its own goods. Chilean products are desired internationally. They make very good products, and as a result, there is demand for those exports. But also, because Chilenos have gotten wealthier, there's been economic growth in Chile over the last 30, 40 years, quite significant growth. They're also importing more. So when you go to the mall, you're gonna see a wider range of products, and a lot of them are imported goods. So whether or not that actually makes an improvement in aggregate demand depends, of course, on the balance between exports and imports. But no matter what, that still is a positive consequence of growth. Okay, the last thing here is something that I actually really like a lot, and it's just that the level of education equals higher levels of democracy and freedom. And there's a pretty compelling argument that as incomes go up, so do levels of education, because you don't find a really poor, well-educated country. You don't really find a well-educated, poor country. And the result of that is that as people become more educated, they also are less likely to be fooled by politicians. They're less likely to be ignorant of other options in life. And as a result of an increased education level and access to information, they can demand more from their government. And so increased levels of education tends to push towards democracy. And if you look at the places that are the most, that have the highest levels of education, they tend to be democratic societies, for education for both men and women. And so that's an interesting consequence or outcome of economic growth, is that there really isn't a wealthy, uneducated country in terms of their average person. Okay, so those 5 things: higher income levels, 6 things: higher living standards, improved technology, increased tax revenue, international context, the level of education equaling higher levels of democracy and freedom. That's a gold mine right there for an evaluation. You only need to know 3, you don't need to know all of them. Pick 3 and own them, and you'll be putting yourself in a good spot for the evaluation. Okay, but now maybe those are the sort of the obvious ones, but let's take a look at the negative consequences of growth, right? You must consider also that an increase in income is not necessarily equivalent to an increased happiness. And so does an increase in income automatically lead to an increase in living standards? And it can be argued that the conclusion that economic growth leads to higher incomes, which results in higher living standards, is flawed, making up some made using some controversial assumptions. There are a lot of really unhappy wealthy people, right? People, just because you have money doesn't mean that you ultimately have more happiness, right? And there's always going to be a trade-off or a consequence of everything. And so there's some very real negative consequences, you could argue, good arguments for negative consequences of economic development. The first one could be something like less leisure time. It's quite possible that the drive for economic growth and higher incomes results in poorer standards of living for individuals. Higher incomes that come about by sacrificing leisure time and neglect of personal relationships would also affect the standard of living. So the resulting preoccupation with more money has its consequence. And it can have its consequence also on children. And all of a sudden the push towards growth and the demands that economic growth developed nations put on its citizens just to pay the bills can lead to two parents having to work in a household. Well, guess what? If two parents are working in the household and they're young kids, who's taking care of the kids? Well, no matter who the person is, they're not as good at caring for a child as one's own parent. And so there's an economic, there is a consequence of economic growth as a result, very directly to its people. Okay. The other thing that could happen is structural changes in society. Typically, economies move from having a larger share of output being created in the primary sector, and then it moves to the secondary sector and onto the tertiary sector. And what that means is that countries go from being primary, agricultural, to secondary, which is they manufacture their own goods, to tertiary. Tertiary is where there's a large portion of the economy based on advice. Tertiary means that you have experts in different areas, and as a result of having experts, other countries hire you to come in and help them. And the United States, you look at the big 5 tax firms in the United States, Ernst & Young, PricewaterhouseCoopers, those firms, those are US-based firms. What do? Do they produce anything? No, nothing. They don't actually produce a thing. What they produce is a service that is desired by developed nations because the United States has had this experience of growth and experience of running businesses and dealing with tax laws. And so they hire the United States firms to come in there and help them. So that's tertiary. But as this happens, it results in some very structural unemployment, if you think about it, right? Which means that not everyone benefits from the growth. If your economy is moving towards a tertiary economy, those are going to be people in your society who have almost always an advanced degree, some sort of education level beyond high school. And as a result of that, if you're doing that, then what if you don't have a university degree? Well, you could have a negative consequence in terms of the economic growth could actually have a negative consequence because of the structural unemployment that's going to happen. Okay, and the last one, which I think is pretty obvious, really, is that growth can lead to massive, if you put it in economic terms, negative externalities of production, right? I mean, I live in Santiago, Chile, and I just look out my classroom, and I can't see the city anymore. If I were here 30 years ago, I'd be able to see the city. Why? Because of the smog. What's the smog like? Well, the smog is a result of industrialization. It's a result of economic growth, and it's destroying resources. I mean, the movement towards the use and consumption of oil for most consumer products, that is a non-renewable good. There's environmental degradation happening as a result of development, and of course, that is a great one. Degradation to the environment is a great use of your evaluation space. On an IB exam. And the other thing, with developed nations, don't think that developed nations aren't destroying the environment as well. It's a lot of times they already have, and you just don't see it anymore. That's how degraded it is. And if you think about it, if you've ever been to the United States and flown over the east coast of the United States, and anywhere you see, almost anywhere where you see homes, farms, not trees, you know that those trees have all been cut down because that was one continuous forest from the coast all the way to the Mississippi River practically. And it was the result, maybe the Ohio River, but it was the reason that those trees aren't there is economic growth, right? Those trees have been consumed and they haven't been replanted. Okay, producing other things and there's advancements, yeah, but that's real environmental degradation. So I just like to say that to students, because don't take the obvious in your lifetime as to what countries are degrading the environment. If it's a developed economy, it already has degraded its environment to a large degree. And actually, governments, European governments, are the best at this, of protecting their environments and putting in laws that make it difficult. Why are they doing that? Well, they see the negative consequences. But they've also acquired enough wealth, and the country has acquired enough, a highest standard of living to actually care. I mean, caring about the environment is a post-materialistic desire. It's not something that developing nations and care about a lot, because they're just trying to get their people out of poverty. They're trying to get their people to a more developed economic state. Okay, so those are the three beautiful negative consequences. They're not beautiful, but negative consequences. They're beautiful for an evaluation of economic growth. And so, in summary, you got to be able to dance between demand management, right? Demand management, which you see over here. Right, deflationary gaps or output gaps can result in a fall of economic growth or negative growth in the short run, and they can be solved by demand side management. So you remember, you are the economist. You have to have answers, evaluation, make a judgment. Evaluation means you make a judgment. If it's demand side, you can use expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policies, right? And such policies may narrow the fluctuations in economic activity on the business cycle diagram. Good. Demand side can stimulate the economy and get the economy going back up. However, if you go too far, then you're going to have inflationary pressure, and so the governments don't want that to go too far. So using the monetary policies and fiscal policies that the government has in its toolbox is the way that they can manage that. But if you think about the business cycle, the trend, the potential, the trend growth line shown in the business cycle is influenced by supply side policies that generate long-term economic growth. And what that means is, as you improve the quality and the quantity of your factors of production, then you're going to have an upward growth trend. And so those are supply side policies. So supply side policies will bring about economic growth in the long run, and demand side policies, right, will help manage the actual economy so that it stays as close to that that long-term potential growth trend, and that way they monitor the economy in such a way that there's not a vast fluctuation, because vast fluctuations in the economy make governments unpopular, and they don't like that. All right. So there's a lot there. There's certainly many things you could add to this as well. But in the end, with economic growth, this gets really soft, right? And soft meaning that you can't really necessarily show all of this on a diagram and show it in a hard, flat way. No, this is the three-dimensional side of economics. This is the really fascinating side of economics. No matter what you do, you're doing the right thing. No matter what you do, you're probably doing the wrong thing. And you, as the econ student, need to be able to make a legitimate argument based on the analysis of a couple graphs and your evaluation of possible directions the government could go in, and then you need to make a judgment and pick one. And that's asking a lot of you, but with this information, you are capable, you can do this, and once you get it, it's really quite fun, okay? So I hope you found this video to be helpful, and I'll talk to you in a bit.